On today's Hibulb Conversations, Richard Hanks, local historian and writer of Indian tribal histories. Richard is a retired professor, author, archivist, and publisher, and has worked with the Stanwood Historical Society for several years. He has written books on Indian tribal histories and has donated his time to help organize the Hibulb archives. His latest contribution to Indian history is a chapter in an anthology of significant Indian women leaders. Richard wrote about Tulalip's own Harriet Shelton Dover. Hi, welcome to Hibulb Conversations. I'm Michelle Hernandez, and today we're here with Richard Hanks. Thank you for joining us, Richard.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yep, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Let us get to know you a little bit. Will you tell us where you were born and when?
I actually was born and raised in Illinois in a small river town.
Okay.
In 1951, August, and really enjoyed that. Kind of think I was looking for it again when I moved up here.
Oh yeah.
Because small town life, I really enjoy that. The kind of close-knit association you have with people. I had a horse, did a lot of riding, and so it was a great time.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about your childhood.
Well, as I said, you had a lot of freedom. It's one of those places where you can run through everybody's backyard and they all know you and they come out and say, "Don't make me call your mother," that kind of thing. And so you're kind of raised by the village that takes place there. And then my father retired. He was a judge, and he retired, and he didn't want to shovel any more snow.
Okay.
And so he moved us to Southern California, to Riverside.
Okay.
Much to my chagrin.
And do you have siblings?
Yes, I had two older brothers.
Okay.
We lost one during the pandemic,
Sorry
unfortunately.
to hear that.
And my eldest is in Arkansas right now, and he's 81.
Okay.
So need to get back there and visit him at some time.
So your mom, dad, and the three boys?
Well, my parents were older when I was born. Obviously, I wasn't planned.
Surprise.
I know. My father was 50, my mother was 39.
Okay.
So they died in the 70s. Yeah.
Okay.
And I was only 19, I think, when my father passed.
And how long did you live in California?
Unfortunately, too long. 50 years.
Okay.
I call it my 50-year exile.
Okay.
Because I really didn't warm up to the California culture. But I did meet my wife there when I was 15. And so I guess it was worth it.
You went to high school in California then?
Yes.
Okay. Which high school did you go to?
Riverside Polytechnic. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about college?
Well, after my wife Robin and I got married, we were able to find a house near the University of California. So I was within walking distance of UC Riverside and decided to go there a lot.
Okay.
So I would work for a while, and then I'd go back, get another degree, and then I would work for a while, and then I would go back and get another degree. And so I picked up all my degrees at UC Riverside. That's my bachelor's, my master's, and my PhD.
Okay, and what are they in?
My bachelor's was in communications with a minor in journalism, and I practiced journalism. I was a mainly broadcast journalist, but also did some newspaper and things like that for a while. And that was in the 80s. And then I went back and I got a degree, a master's in public history with a specialty in archival management. And so I did that for a while, ended up working in archives, museums, and did manage a state project in Riverside for a while. And then because as I was running an archive, two Gabrielino women came in, and we happened to have a collection that they were very interested in, and they kind of pursued me to do a book on that.
Oh.
And it took them 6 years, but I finally surrendered. There was a chance to go back, and I had a professor come in and say I should go for my PhD, and I had something to write about.
Okay.
So I did.
And what got you so interested in history?
Stories when I was a boy. We have a fairly interesting family history, and so my father would tell stories, and I just, I always think about that. What makes somebody want to be a firefighter or a police officer? I just really was fascinated by those stories about people and what they did and the choices they made, whether to turn left or right at any point in your life, and how everything was different. And I really wanted to pursue that.
You helped us and you volunteered at the Hibulb Cultural Center.
Yes.
Had you worked with tribes before?
Well, I started getting involved with tribal people in the 80s. I was a talk show host for a while, And so I had an Apache man call up, and when I was on air, and I invited him to come in, and we did a show with him on Native American religion. And then I began Sweat Lodge with him. He was doing that, so I started with that. And that led me to meeting a lot of Lakota who were coming out from South Dakota, and we were involved in raising money for them and continued doing that. And then in the 90s, as I said, I met the Gabrielino sisters, and that kind of changed everything for me. So I started working with what they call Free Gabrielino, because they're not recognized, they're not federally recognized. And did that for a while. And then the early 2000s, that led me to working with the Saboba tribe of San Jacinto, in which I later then participated in a book on the tribe, which came out in 2018.
And you were still in California at this time?
We moved up here in 2014.
Okay. What brought you up here?
We knew people up here, and as I said, anything outside of California I was eager for. So especially Southern California, I'm not a real big heat person. So we came and we traveled around and looked for different places, and kept kind of gravitating back to Camino Island, which is where we settled.
Okay. And you've been there since like the early 2000s?
2014,
Okay.
yeah, the summer.
Oh,
yeah.
wonderful.
Beautiful. Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
I tell people I moved up here for the weather.
Yeah.
They don't
this fall must be killing you.
I know, this is horrible right now. It's just way too dry for me. It's like, please rain.
Yeah, you and I both.
Yeah.
You're also an archivist. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I became an archivist. To be frank, it's because that's where the good stories are.
Okay.
And I'm always interested in the stories. So although, I like the idea that archivists are, the gatekeepers to this information, and they play a vital role in whatever researchers are trying to do. And so it really advances education, advances understanding, and all of that. So I enjoyed that aspect of it, and I still do. But in my heart of hearts, I'm really looking for the stories.
Yeah. And is that how you got into book writing?
I always wanted to be a writer, even as a kid.
Yeah, really?
I know, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but,
I think a lot of kids start that way.
Maybe, I guess so, but it was always something that fascinated me, because I loved the stories, so I wanted to tell the stories. And for a historian, the main problem that you have is access to information.
Right.
I pray that I could have been a novelist, because then you just have to sit down and go, hey, let's just
think something up.
Envision something, But that didn't turn out to be me. I really like to find the true stories, especially those voices that have not been heard or did not come out. When I started studying history in 1969, it was about dead elite white guys and their biographies. And then we went through Marxism and classism and all the way up. And by the time I was getting my PhD, history had changed. And I still believe today that following the woman, following the wagon is as important as the governor, of the state or something. They tell us something about the human condition, which I think is fascinating. Yeah.
So when you're writing books, when you're looking for content, you're looking for those stories.
Sure.
Yeah. And anything else that you're looking for?
No, I think the stories tell it all. I really do. I mean, for history, it's just finding, enough access to enough information to really bring it to life. I've taken creative writing, and I did write one novel based upon the journals of my wife, her grandmother, which was a very intriguing thing to do. But since I've really written for every venue possible, from politics to scholarly writing to newspapers to you name it, I've written for that venue. Press releases, thousands.
Yeah.
And so my emphasis is really trying to bring something to life as a story.
Right.
I don't want to just give you dry events and dates, and that's how so many people learned history in high school. It's just and wrote memorization. My intent is to really excite you through understanding the people themselves better. And it's difficult because I can't make up dialogue. I can't do those kinds of things. So I always look for their voice, and when I'm lucky enough to find it, it's a rare treat.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your early life with us. When we come back from our break, we'll talk about your chapter on Harriet Shelton Dover. We'll be right back with more Hibulb Conversations. Welcome back to Hibulb Conversations. Today we're here with Richard Hanks. Welcome back.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about the chapter you wrote on Harriet Shelton Dover, but before we get into that, can you tell us about some of the other books you've written?
Sure. Yeah, I've done 8 books so far, 3 of those co-written with others. I turned my dissertation, which is called "This War is for a Whole Life: The Culture of Resistance Among Southern California Indians." I did that and then turned that into a manuscript. Wow. And that's actually the quote of the books. I always like to name my books after something that's within them, and that was the famous last words of a famous resistance leader in Southern California, Antonio Guerra, before they shot him.
Wow.
That this war is for a whole life. And then others, I've done a little Arcadia book on a group of people in California. I did one on the Civil War, on Edwin Higley, called Vermont's Proper Son, and he was a first lieutenant in the Vermont Cavalry. I also just finished one recently called To Seek the Smiles of Dame Fortune, on Stanwood residents that went to the Yukon. And I did one on 50 veterans that we honor on our memorial up in Redlands called
Wow.
Solomon Drum's Thrill. That's kind of a recap.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. I would tell you about the Saboba book, but I can't pronounce the senior name of it. So. But I co-wrote with an archaeologist on a history of the tribe, the Saboba Nation.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, you wrote a chapter of Harriet Shelton Dover for the book Indigenous Activism, Profiles of Native Women in Contemporary America. How did that come about?
Well, the chief editor on that was a professor I've worked with for many years. His name's Cliff Trafser. He runs the Costo Chair, which is one of the largest endowed Native American chairs. He's Wyandotte at UC Riverside, and I did much of my studying through him. And this originally was a Texas Tech idea of getting it's an anthology of various essays on women across Native women across the country. So he approached me and said, would you do one? And he suggested a woman that we know in Southern California, and I said, I live in the Puget Sound.
Yeah.
So I'd been working on Harriet's papers since I volunteered at the Hibulb archives. And I was just intrigued by her resilience. And what really fascinated me about Harriet, and we see this a lot, there's much talk recently about how black women had to be such a force
Right.
for civil rights coming up. And I think that we don't understand what Native women have done so much for the culture, because so much was lost,
Right.
especially through white encroachment and disease and then warfare, that women had to take a more even in patriarchal societies, they had to step up and do that. And Harriet is the ultimate culture bearer. I mean, her father was the one that went out and put in story polls,
Sure.
stories of elders after he interviewed them. But Harriet kept them alive.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting to me. I mean, she wrote about them. She put them in the Seattle papers. And this is something that goes on with all Native nations that I see today, how much to release, how much to keep to themselves. But Harriet really had a fascinating life in that respect.
Yeah. And what intrigued you so much about Harriet?
Well, I just think that, again, her persistence,
Yeah.
is that it's very difficult, as she goes on to be one of the first women on the tribal council, first chairwoman, that kind of thing. That's a difficult time to do this. She's doing it in the 40s and the 50s
Yeah.
and things like that. So it took an amazing amount of just resilience, as I said, and her ability to just pursue her ideals no matter what, and her devotion to her father, William Shelton.
Sure.
But at the core of it, and then I was lucky enough to interview before he passed her child, Wayne Williams.
Yeah.
And that whole family just is, I've never seen a richer archive among Native American tribes, not that I have vast experience, but the ones I've been involved with, I've never seen a richer archive than what you have here at Hibulb.
Yep. Tell us a little bit about the chapter.
Well, I just follow her life. I open it, with her grandmother, having her go out and address the 4 directions,
Yeah.
the 4 spirits, and announce that she's here, which I think was just awesome. And many things that are in there about trying to develop better educational facilities, for the kids through the Marysville school system, getting more people to pay attention to these kind of things, and just her involvement with just bringing that culture to the awareness of the American public, and particularly the Washington State public. And I think that makes such a big difference. did an interview with one of the great bird singers of Southern California, and Robert Levi, and he was that same thing. We need to get out and let people know who we are. But there is, as I said, this tension between how much is too much and where do you draw that line. But Harriet was really one to get out there and engage the white public.
And how did you go getting about so much information about her? When I read it, I really thought that this chapter was based on conversations you had directly had with her.
Well, good.
Yep.
Then I pulled that off.
It was great. Yeah.
Well, obviously her book, you know, the one that she, the interviews that she had done, and that was very helpful. And then there was, as I said, I was working on her papers, so I got to really see the chronology of Harriet's life through various aspects. And the archive also hold other interviews that were done by her. There were some taped interviews that I was able to watch, and so that's really you just get a feeling after a while. If you live with people like I do as a historian, you get to kind of feel like you know them, and so that's what I work for.
Aside from Harriet and Wayne and William, have you done research on any other Tulalips?
Not to date.
Okay.
Hopeful.
Any plans for the future?
Well, I mean, I would love to write more about the people of Tulalip or individuals of Tulalip. And that would be something that I hope down the road that could come about. I think I've done a lot of work. I have a chapter in my first book on boarding schools, for example, and I was running some panels at Sherman Institute, which is still active in Riverside. And so, Cliff Trasser, who I mentioned earlier, has written one about Sherman called Boarding School Blues, which is a really interesting book in and of itself. And therefore, I think that more could be done on the Tulalip boarding school.
Oh, I'd love that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with more Hibulb Conversations. Welcome back to Hibulb Conversations. Today we're here with Richard Hanks. Welcome back.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about research. Researching history. What is your advice to students who are looking for information about their tribes beyond a Google search?
Well, I always say that you should start in something like that in your own backyard. I mean, there are people that surround Native students all the time, whether they be friends, parents, peers, teachers, librarians, and they know things. So the biggest point of being a good researcher is being curious, wanting to know why. And that's the ultimate question we're all trying to ask as a journalist or as a historian, why? And so I would start with that. And then if you find something that excites you, then there are other resources that you can go about. I mean, I taught for several years, so saying read, I know it kind of stuns them in the seat, it's like they don't like to read. But there are some very, you can get a lot of information just from articles. You don't have to attack a tome about Indian history. You can just do it through smaller articles like that to excite. And then when you finally get something that you're involved with that you think is interesting, you want to pursue, then it's time to look at the larger places like archives or museums or things like that. And approaching archives it takes some understanding, let's put it that way. So that's the difference though. But I would, besides reading and understanding how other people do things and talking to people around you, going to visit those kinds of people who have the knowledge, I think that's where you begin.
And will you tell us the difference between archives and libraries?
Sure. I once did a seminar, Cats and Dogs Living Together, librarians and archivists, because we're trained differently.
Yep.
And the thing about librarians and libraries is that they tend to be categorized. You go to the history section, you want to read history. You go to the science section if you want to read on science. But in archives, you could have pieces of information in multiple kinds of collections. Now, it used to be that you had to base that upon the knowledge of the archivist. So you could come in and say, my topic is A, and they would say, well, then you need to also say B, C, D, and X over here, because that's going to help you. Now, the great leveler is the database, which we're all very happy about, because you can look it up, and then you can get a list of things, and that's it. So you want to make an appointment with an archivist. I can't stress that enough, because walk-ins off the street can oftentimes irritate an archivist. because they have to
I
be.
feel that.
I know. They have to be ready.
Yeah.
And so if you let them know you're coming and this is my subject and this is my topic, then they're going to be able to even do their own research, look at their own materials and go, all right. So when you walk in, they have something ready for you to do. And of course, the whole atmosphere is different. You know, you can maybe take a sheet of paper and a pencil. That's it. You're not allowed to take anything else in there. Don't be surprised if they search your materials on the way out.
Yeah.
You know, because I've done work in many archives where they ended up losing a lot of things.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they have a history of it if nobody's really overseeing. Surprisingly enough, you don't get a lot of money that's thrown at archives. So that's
Weird,
why it happens. Yeah. So just be prepared, think ahead. But don't be, even when it goes back to the students, don't be shy about doing it. There's plenty of places. I just, looking at, University of Washington or Washington State or Western up here, and they have a lot of great portals there. You can see a lot of digital information immediately. You can, move through those. If you have specific, questions that you want, you can ask the archivist, and you can do that. So take advantage of what social media has been able to gain for you in terms of finding information. There is more information out there digitally now than there ever has been.
Isn't that wonderful?
I know.
You have a specific interest in the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln, and rumor has it you're related to Abraham Lincoln?
I'm a cousin relationship.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. And those were some of the stories my father used to tell when I was
Okay.
growing up, which always intrigued me, and I spent the last several decades of diving into that family history. And what I discovered, as I always say, the truth is even more exciting than fiction in many cases. So I place myself as a third cousin to Lincoln based upon what we know about it. We don't know much about his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, but she was of the same Hanks clan as myself through Virginia that came through. Who her parents are a point of controversy, I'll say that. But so what's more than the genetic proximity, which I say is as exciting as discussing how many angels dance on the head of a pin. More than that is the fact that Lincoln was close to the family. He lived with them. He visited them. The farthest excursion west that he ever did in 1859 was staying with my family. And he said at that time, I'm here, he didn't want to let know his political views. So I'm here to visit my kinswoman, Louisiana Hanks Delahaye, and she's the sister of my great-grandfather.
Wow.
So my family had a lot to do in bloody Kansas prior to the war.
And do you think that has triggered your appeal in history?
Well, certainly, I've spent several decades looking at just that part of it, so it certainly it captured my attention early on. Yeah, I would say so.
Well, he's, fairly famous throughout history.
Yes.
And they say representation is important. And
Yes.
think
I still do a lot of Lincoln talks.
Yeah.
So I started writing a book on this, but the book is now, I think it'll be the last thing I do before I die, because I have boxes and boxes and boxes of materials that I've collected over the years, and I just don't quite know where to start. I'd have to just have a warehouse where I could spread it out. Yeah. But other than that, I do give a lot of talks about his involvement with the family and these controversial figures that were around him.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, to know about the family history and then to hear about him in school too. I think it's the same type of a pull Native American students have to, those big figures like Sitting Bull or Geronimo that you hear about so much. So I love that.
Right.
Yeah. How do we get our younger generation interested in history? It's the $1 million question.
If I knew that, I'd still be in the classroom somewhere, I'll tell you that. I'll tell you the one thing that I did that I think was the most successful, and I'm not unique in this, there are others that have done it, but I'd asked them whether I was teaching at the first part of history up to the Civil War or Civil War up to the present, is that I want you to go out and interview somebody in your family, and they were like, oh, geez,
Such a burden.
I know. So, but then people that didn't like writing, they didn't like history, they didn't like school, they would give me the best stuff I ever saw. Because you go and I remember one girl, it was a great aunt, and she was African American, and she found out her great aunt at 15 went to Florida to visit somebody and was forced to ride in the back of a bus for the first time.
Wow.
Had to experience racism on that par, and that changed her whole perspective.
I'm sure.
This is why I'm saying about even with Native students, is that they would just ask, the family. The biggest thing that doesn't happen, you don't ask the question. And they're huge repositories of knowledge, and they're right there. And the one thing that I hear more often than anything else when I worked in archives as a public historian or in a museum is people would come in their 60s or, I hated this stuff, and now I never asked my parents.
Yeah.
I never asked my grandparents. And what could they have told me?
Yeah.
And I go, we're all in that same boat.
Yeah.
If we just thought about it at the time. But as I have often said, we get distracted by living our lives.
Sure.
And so we don't come to that point in our life until perhaps it's too late.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying, start with where you are.
Yeah.
Start with the people around you
Yeah.
and see if you can appreciate that.
And start now.
And start now.
Yeah, before it's too late.
Oh, and I think one of the luckiest things I did is I took an oral history class at UCR when I was an undergrad, and I interviewed my mother on tape. And to have those tapes are precious. She
Yeah.
talked about her life growing up and coal strikes in southern Illinois and all these things that were going on and everything. And you just hearing her laugh and sitting
Oh,
there
yeah,
and hearing her
having
tell the
that.
stories. I mean, those are just precious.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking time to be here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I've enjoyed sitting here learning about you and your career and the books you've written, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Hibulb Conversations. I'm Michelle Hernandez. Until next time.